Sarah Martinez was used to being the smallest person in the room, but she never let that stop her. At 24 years old, standing just over 5 feet tall, she moved with a calm strength that showed she'd earned every bit of respect she had. After 3 years in the army, pulling her dark hair back in military style felt like second nature. The sun blazed down on the dusty practice field at Fort Henderson. Nearly 300 soldiers had shown up for what should have been just another day of training. The base hummed with energy as troops moved in groups, their boots hitting the packed dirt in steady rhythm. Gear clanged and voices echoed across the field while different units got ready for their scheduled drills. Sarah glanced at her watch and tightened the straps on her practice gear. Today felt different. Today she'd be teaching advanced fighting moves to soldiers from all over the base. Her instructor, Sergeant Williams, had picked her personally for this job. The day before, he'd told her something she wouldn't forget. "Martinez, you've got what these soldiers need to see. This isn't about how big or strong you are. It's about smart moves, perfect timing, and turning your enemy's power against them." Sarah understood what he meant. In a world full of bigger, stronger soldiers, she'd learned to win through skill instead of muscle. The crowd started forming a huge circle on the practice field. Soldiers from different units chatted with each other, and some looked doubtful about what they were going to see. Plenty had heard stories about Sarah's skills in close combat, but watching a small woman get ready to teach fighting moves against bigger guys made some people whisper and raise their eyebrows. Standing in that crowd was Corporal Jake Thompson, a guy whose presence always seemed to demand attention for the wrong reasons. At over 6 feet tall with wide shoulders and thick arms, Jake had built his reputation on believing the military should favor the physically strong. His eyes showed clear disgust as he watched Sarah get ready. To him, the idea that this woman could teach real combat skills seemed like a complete waste of time. Jake had enlisted 2 years back, bringing old-fashioned ideas with him. He'd grown up in a home where men and women had very separate roles, and he couldn't accept that the modern military had women fighting right alongside men. His discomfort showed through in small but constant acts of disrespect toward women in uniform. As things kicked off, Sergeant Williams explained what they'd be learning. "Today we're covering defensive moves that work no matter how big or strong you are," he told the group. "What matters is understanding balance, timing, and using your attacker's own force instead of fighting it head-on." Sarah stepped forward with careful, controlled movements. She'd spent countless hours getting these techniques down perfectly, knowing that in real fights she might face people much bigger and stronger. The skills she'd mastered weren't just for practice. They could save her life one day. The first part went perfectly. Sarah worked with a volunteer who followed the planned movements, showing how the right technique could beat a major size difference. The watching soldiers looked impressed as they saw throws and defensive moves that challenged everything they thought they knew about fighting. But Jake Thompson watched with growing anger. Every successful move Sarah made seemed to shake something deep in how he saw the world. He started making quiet remarks to the soldiers near him, questioning whether these moves would work in a real fight. His voice carried just far enough for others to hear, creating tension in the crowd. As the lesson continued, Jake's comments got louder. "This is all fake," he muttered. "In a real fight, none of this fancy stuff would help." Some soldiers shifted awkwardly, knowing his commentary during official training was completely inappropriate. But Jake didn't seem to notice or care about the tension he was causing. Sarah heard the interruption but stayed focused on her demonstration. She'd dealt with this kind of resistance before and knew the best response was simply to keep performing at her best. Her technique proved more than words ever could, and she trusted most soldiers watching could see the real value in what they were learning. The morning moved forward with different scenarios and techniques on display. Sarah worked with various volunteers, each one presenting unique challenges that let her show how versatile and effective proper defensive training could be. The crowd stayed engaged, with most soldiers asking smart questions and taking notes on what they were seeing. But Jake's doubt kept getting louder. During a quick break, he walked up to another soldier and spoke loud enough for Sarah to hear clearly. "I bet she couldn't defend herself if someone really wanted to hurt her," he said. "All this training is just for show. In a real situation, size and strength still win." The comment hung in the air like a dare. Several soldiers looked back and forth between Jake and Sarah, feeling that something was building toward a clash. Sergeant Williams noticed the tension and tried to get everyone's attention back on the scheduled training, but the damage was done. The mood had shifted from learning and respect to something dangerous. Sarah took a deep breath and made a choice that would change everything. Instead of ignoring Jake's comments or reporting him through official channels, she decided to face the challenge head-on. "Corporal Thompson," she said, her voice clear and steady, "would you like to volunteer for the next part?" The question brought instant silence from the watching soldier. Everyone knew this was no longer just a training exercise. This had become something personal, something bigger. Jake looked around at all the faces watching him, realizing his complaints had led to this moment where he'd either have to back down or prove what he believed. For a few seconds Jake froze. He hadn't expected his complaints would lead to a direct challenge, and now he found himself in a spot where his reputation was on the line in front of 300 fellow soldiers. The smart choice would have been to politely decline and let the demonstration continue as planned. But Jake's pride and his deep beliefs about physical strength wouldn't let him walk away. "Sure," he said, stepping forward with more confidence than he really felt. "Let's see how these moves work against someone who isn't following your script." The crowd of soldiers pressed in closer, forming a tighter circle around the two figures now facing each other in the center. What had started as routine training was about to become something none of them would ever forget. The tension on the practice field was so thick you could feel it. Sarah Martinez stood facing Jake Thompson in the center of a circle formed by nearly 300 soldiers, all of whom had stopped talking to focus on what was happening. The morning sun seemed to burn even hotter as the two soldiers prepared for what everyone knew would be more than just practice. Sergeant Williams stepped forward, trying to keep control. "This will be a controlled demonstration," he said firmly. "We're here to learn defensive moves, not to settle personal fights." His words were aimed mostly at Jake, but there was a clear feeling that this interaction might not stay as controlled as it should. Sarah adjusted her position, automatically shifting into the balanced stance she'd practiced thousands of times. Her breathing stayed steady and controlled, a technique she'd learned not just for physical readiness, but for keeping her mind clear. She'd been in situations like this before, though never in front of so many people. The key was to stay calm and let her training take over, no matter what emotions her opponent brought with him. Jake rolled his shoulders and cracked his knuckles, showing off the kind of intimidation moves that had worked for him in less formal fights. At over 6 feet tall and weighing nearly twice what Sarah did, he had serious physical advantages that had always made him confident in these situations. His experience wrestling in high school and fighting in weekend bar brawls had convinced him that size and aggression were all that mattered in any physical fight. The watching soldiers formed an almost perfect circle, their faces showing curiosity, concern, and excitement mixed together. Many of them had their own thoughts about the ongoing debates over women in combat roles, and they knew that what happened in the next few minutes might shape those discussions for years. Some pulled out their phones, even though official rules banned recording during training. "Remember," Sergeant Williams called out, "this is about showing technique. We're not here to prove who's tougher." But even as he said these words, everyone there understood that much more was at stake than just showing proper defensive position. Sarah nodded to show she'd heard the sergeant's instructions, then looked straight at Jake. "We'll start with a basic situation," she said professionally. "You'll try a simple attack, and I'll show the right defensive response." Her voice stayed calm and instructional despite the obvious personal hostility Jake had been showing all morning. Jake sneered slightly, his confidence growing as he looked down at his smaller opponent. "Just don't blame me when your fancy moves don't work against real strength," he said loud enough for the front row to hear clearly. Several of them exchanged glances, knowing Jake was crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed during official training. The first exchange happened exactly as it should. Jake threw a slow, obvious punch that was meant to let Sarah show a blocking move, followed by a controlled takedown. To the watching soldiers, it looked like a perfect example of how proper training could beat a size advantage. Sarah performed the defensive sequence flawlessly, using Jake's momentum against him and bringing him down to one knee in a position where she could have finished him off, if this had been real combat. But instead of admitting how effective that was, Jake quickly got back up with obvious irritation. "That was just because I was going easy," he announced to the crowd. "In a real fight, I wouldn't make it that obvious." His comment drew some uncomfortable sounds from the watching soldiers, who could see he wasn't responding the right way to what was supposed to be a learning exercise. Sarah stayed professional despite Jake's attitude. "Would you like to try again with a more realistic situation?" she asked. "We can show how these moves work even when the attacker isn't cooperating." This was where things started to get worse than anyone expected. Jake's pride had been hurt by being taken down so easily in front of 300 of his peers, and his response was to get more aggressive instead of admitting the skill Sarah had shown. "Fine," he said, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there during the first round. "Let's see how you handle someone who's really trying." Sergeant Williams sensed the change in Jake's mood and stepped forward to stop things. "Corporal Thompson, remember this is a demonstration, not a competition," he warned. But Jake was already moving, his body language showing he'd moved beyond controlled training into something more personal and dangerous. The second exchange started the same way, but Jake's approach was different this time. Instead of the slow, controlled movements that were right for a training demonstration, he came forward with real aggression. His punch was faster and carried genuine force, making Sarah react with the kind of intensity she'd use in actual combat instead of a teaching exercise. Sarah's response was instant and exact. She deflected Jake's incoming punch using a move that redirected his energy while creating an opening for a counterattack. Her movements flowed together in a sequence that showed years of dedicated training and natural ability. But instead of stopping where the technique was successfully shown, as would have been right for a training exercise, Jake kept pressing forward aggressively. The watching soldiers could see that something fundamental had changed between the two combatants. What had started as educational had transformed into something more serious and potentially dangerous. Several of them looked toward Sergeant Williams, expecting him to stop things before they got worse. But everything was happening too fast for anyone to step in. Jake's next move crossed every line. Frustrated that he couldn't overwhelm Sarah through straight aggression, he gave up any pretense of being part of a controlled training exercise. His face twisted with anger and wounded pride as he pulled back his right arm and threw himself forward in what was clearly meant to be a genuinely harmful attack. "You need to learn your place," he snarled as he moved toward Sarah with clear intent to cause injury instead of demonstrate technique. His movement was no longer the controlled action of a soldier in training, but the aggressive assault of someone whose ego had been damaged beyond his ability to control himself. The watching soldiers gasped together as they realized Jake had completely abandoned the rules of the exercise. This was no longer about showing combat techniques or even about settling a disagreement through proper military channels. This had become a genuine assault happening in front of 300 witnesses. Sarah's training and instincts took over completely. She could see in Jake's eyes and body language that he was no longer holding back, that he genuinely meant to hurt her as punishment for embarrassing him in front of everyone. Her response shifted immediately from demonstration mode to survival mode, calling on every hour of training she'd put in preparing for exactly this type of situation. As Jake's aggressive strike came toward her, Sarah moved with the smooth precision of someone whose body had been trained to respond automatically to threats. She stepped slightly to the side, letting Jake's momentum carry him past where she'd been while grabbing his extended arm at the same time. Her grip locked onto his wrist and forearm with the kind of exact positioning that only came from extensive practice. What happened next took only seconds, but would be remembered by every witness for the rest of their lives. Sarah used Jake's forward momentum in his committed position to perform a move that was both perfectly legal within military combat training and devastatingly effective. She pivoted her body while keeping her grip on Jake's arm, creating a lever that turned his own strength and momentum against him in the most dramatic way possible. The sound that echoed across the practice field was unlike anything most of the watching soldiers had ever heard. It was a sharp crack that seemed to cut through the morning air like a gunshot, followed immediately by Jake Thompson's scream of pain, so intense it made several soldiers step backward. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Jake's continued cries as he collapsed to the ground, holding his right arm. Sarah Martinez stood exactly where her defensive move had left her, her breathing still controlled and her stance balanced, but her face had gone pale as she realized what had just happened. The technique she'd performed was one she'd practiced hundreds of times, but always in controlled settings with partners who were working with her instead of attacking her with genuine intent to harm. The result had been far more severe than anything she'd ever experienced in training. Sergeant Williams was the first to react, rushing toward Jake while shouting orders to the gathered soldiers. "Get a medic over here now," he commanded, his voice cutting through the shocked silence that had fallen over the practice field. "Everyone else, step back and give us." His training as an officer kicked in automatically, but his face showed the same shock visible on everyone else there. The medics arrived within minutes, though it felt like hours to everyone watching. As they began checking Jake's injury, it became clear this was far more serious than anyone had first thought. His right arm was bent at an unnatural angle, and the way he was protecting it suggested multiple bones had been broken. "We need to get him to the base hospital right away," the lead medic said after his first examination. "This looks like a compound fracture of both major forearm bones, possibly with nerve damage." The medical terms meant little to most of the watching soldiers, but the urgency in the medic's voice made everyone understand how serious this was. As Jake was loaded onto a stretcher and carried away from the practice field, the remaining soldiers stood in stunned silence. Many of them were replaying in their minds what they'd just witnessed, trying to understand how routine training had reached this point. The conversations that started were hushed and uncertain as everyone struggled to process what it all meant. Sarah stayed standing in the same spot where it had happened, her mind racing as she tried to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. She had acted purely in self-defense, responding to what she genuinely saw as a serious threat to her safety. But the outcome was far worse than she'd intended or expected, and she knew her life in the military was about to get much more complicated. Sergeant Williams approached her with concern and professional duty written across his face. "Martinez," he said quietly, "I need you to come with me. We have to report this right away and get your statement while everything is still fresh." Sarah nodded, Understanding this was the beginning of what would likely be a long investigation into what had happened. The base commander, Colonel Patricia Hayes, arrived at the scene within 30 minutes of being notified. She was a career military officer who had handled plenty of unusual situations, but this presented challenges that went far beyond typical discipline issues. A female soldier had seriously injured a male colleague during what was supposed to be routine training, and she knew the incident would attract attention from far beyond their immediate command. The first interviews began that same afternoon. Sarah found herself sitting across from Colonel Hayes and the base's legal officer, carefully going through every detail of what had led to the confrontation and exactly what had happened during the critical moments when Jake's arm was broken. Her story was clear and consistent, emphasizing that she'd acted in self-defense against what she saw as a genuine assault. "At what point did you realize Corporal Thompson was no longer taking part in a training exercise?" Colonel Hayes asked during one part of the interview. Sarah thought carefully before responding, knowing her answer might have serious implications for how the incident would ultimately be judged. "When he said I needed to learn my place and came at me with clear intent to hurt me," Sarah replied. His body language and facial expression made it obvious he was no longer interested in showing techniques. "He was attacking me, and I responded the way I should." Her answer was recorded carefully by the legal officer, who recognized how important it was to establish Sarah's state of mind during those critical moments. Meanwhile, other soldiers who had witnessed everything were being interviewed separately. Their stories were remarkably similar, with most of them describing Jake's growing aggression and inappropriate comments throughout the morning. Several soldiers specifically mentioned they'd expected Sergeant Williams to stop the exercise before it reached the point of actual confrontation. Private Jennifer Walsh, who had been standing in the front row of spectators, gave particularly detailed testimony. Corporal Thompson was making disrespectful comments throughout the demonstration, she told investigator. When Specialist Martinez offered him the chance to volunteer, it was obvious he saw it as a challenge to his authority instead of a learning opportunity. His whole attitude changed, and you could see he was genuinely angry. The medical report on Jake's injuries confirmed how severe things were. He'd suffered compound fractures of both major bones in his right forearm, along with significant tissue damage and possible nerve injury. The surgeon who performed the first operation estimated Jake would need multiple surgeries and months of rehab before getting even partial use of his right arm back. News of the incident spread quickly throughout the base, and eventually reached media outlets that covered military news. The story of a female soldier breaking a male colleague's arm during a training demonstration touched on several sensitive subjects, including women in combat roles, military training rules, and questions about appropriate responses to workplace harassment. Sarah found herself at the center of discussions she'd never wanted to be part of. Some commentators praised her for standing up to what they called bullying and harassment, while others questioned whether her response had matched the threat she faced. The debate raged in military publications, social media, and even some mainstream news outlets. The official investigation took several weeks to finish. Investigators reviewed testimony from dozens of witnesses, examined video footage from security cameras that had captured parts of the incident, and talked with experts on military combat training and appropriate force responses. Their findings would determine whether charges would be filed against either Sarah or Jake. Colonel Hayes faced pressure from multiple directions as the investigation moved forward. Some members of Congress who had heard about the incident were asking questions about training rules and whether proper safeguards existed to prevent this type of situation. At the same time, she had to balance the need for thorough investigation with keeping morale and effectiveness within her command strong. The final report, when it was eventually released, concluded that Sarah had acted appropriately in self-defense against an unprovoked assault. The investigation found that Jake had clearly gone beyond the bounds of the training exercise and had started genuine violence against a fellow soldier. While the severity of his injuries was unfortunate, the report stated that Sarah's response had been both legally justified and consistent with her training. Jake Thompson was ultimately discharged from the military under less than honorable conditions. His career ended by the incident that had begun with his unwillingness to accept that combat effectiveness wasn't determined only by size and gender. His recovery was slow and incomplete, leaving him with permanent limitations in using his right arm and serving as a daily reminder of the consequences of his actions that morning. Sarah Martinez continued her military career, though the incident followed her wherever she went. She was eventually promoted to sergeant and became an instructor herself, using her experience to help other soldiers understand both the technical aspects of combat training and the importance of keeping appropriate boundaries during exercises. She never forgot the morning when everything changed in front of nearly 300 witnesses, and she made sure every soldier she trained understood that respect and professionalism were just as important as physical technique. The practice field at Fort Henderson returned to its normal routines, but the story of that morning became part of the base's history. New soldiers arriving for training would always hear about the day when a female soldier broke a man's arm in front of hundreds of witnesses, and the story served as both a warning about the dangers of letting personal prejudices override military discipline, and proof that combat effectiveness came in many different forms. Years later, when military historians looked back at the incident, they would point to it as a turning point in discussions about women in combat roles and the importance of keeping professional standards regardless of personal belief. The morning that had started as routine training had become a defining moment that influenced military culture far beyond the boundaries of Fort Henderson.